They always told me fate is fair, that every mother recognizes her child at first sight, and that love can cross any distance. But what if fate hides your own son's face from you? Until it's too late. I lived through that kind of war story. I was there, in Saigon, surrounded by screams and stretchers, just a nurse holding the hands of men I didn't know. Until I held one hand that changed everything. A hand I had unknowingly held before, 22 years earlier, the day I had to give my baby away. Maybe you carry a guilt like that too. A silent pain. An emotional story you chose not to tell anyone. I know it sounds impossible, but it's exactly in silence that the biggest truths hide. And my truth stayed locked away for years, in a box, in a letter no one ever read, in an old black and white photo. Until the day the war brought back what had always been mine. What I'm about to share with you isn't just about loss or late reunions. It's about learning to recognize love even when it comes wrapped in pain. And if you let yourself listen to my story all the way through, I promise you'll see something that might change the way you look at the secrets you've kept tucked away all this time. Sometimes the greatest loves are the ones that never get the chance to say goodbye. My name is Hattie Mae Langston. I'm 84 years old, and most of who I am now lives in the silence of these 4 wooden walls, where I stay with my granddaughter, deep in the heart of Texas. I was a medevac nurse during the Battle of Saigon. I saw things no history book dares to describe. But what stayed with me the most was what I didn't see. Or rather, what I saw too late. Today my hair is white and coily, tied with colorful bands my granddaughter gives me as gifts. But back then, my uniform had more blood than fabric. And even in the middle of all that, there was a man, a young man, whose name I didn't know, just another wounded soldier, until I found out he was mine. This war story isn't about bravery or medals. It's about a secret buried beneath gauze and silence. And I want you to stay, to sit here with me, like someone listening to their grandmother, slowly opening her heart, piece by piece, with no rush. Grab a blanket, take a deep breath, and open your heart. Because this emotional story begins with the sound of a helicopter and ends with a photograph that never found a place on the wall. And if any part of this story stirs something you've been holding deep inside, I ask you, share it. Subscribe to this channel and keep the circle going. Because stories like this, my dear, they can't die with us. There was a sound I never quite knew how to name. It wasn't exactly a scream, not exactly a cry. It was more like time groaning as it bent under the weight of memories. That sound came every time a stretcher's wheels folded onto the helicopter's metal floor. The sound of metal against metal, of a life being dragged to the edge of survival. It cut through me like a prayer that never got answered, and that's how he arrived, through that choked-up sound hanging in the air. The boy, the soldier, the son I didn't know was mine. It was late afternoon in Saigon, and the sky looked like a curtain stained with blood and smoke. I couldn't even tell the days apart anymore. When you're a nurse in a war zone, time melts into shifts made of pain. My body moved to a rhythm that wasn't mine. It belonged to the wounded, to the dead, to the barely alive. I remember that day. Something strange rode the wind. I don't know if it was the sudden shift in heat or the thicker scent of something burning, but something made me look before I was supposed to, like fate tapping me on the shoulder. And when I looked toward the field hospital entrance, I saw 4 soldiers rushing in, carrying a stretcher, covered in mud and blood, up to their shoulders. The helicopter had barely landed, and that sound, the folding metal, was already pressing into everyone's chest with a kind of urgency. Only those who've had to fight for someone's life truly know. He wasn't the most injured soldier I'd seen, not the youngest either. But there was something In the way his shoulders slumped, the way his head tilted, like he was searching for someone who'd already gone. His eyes were half open, and even though he didn't look right at me, I felt like he saw something in me, like he was searching for me. I wanted to ignore it. I had other patients, protocols, but my body moved toward him like it was pulled by some old magnet, the kind you find buried in a sewing box next to faded photos. The name tag was smudged. All I could make out were the initials, TM. And even that didn't make sense. But my heart, oh, it started making a sound I hadn't heard in years. Something between crying and warning. Like when you dream about a place you've never been, but swear you once lived there. He had a deep wound along his side. Internal bleeding, shallow breathing, erratic pulse. I did what I was trained to do. Applied pressure, took a deep breath, ordered morphine. I touched his face to check consciousness, and he moaned softly, like someone trying to say a name with a mouthful of cotton. My name? His? Someone else's? I'll never know. His skin was warm under my fingers, but his sweat was already cold. He was slipping away, and I stood there, holding his hand, not knowing I was holding the thread of a life that had begun inside me. A few minutes later, while we tried to stabilize his blood pressure, I noticed a small chain around his neck, a wooden pendant. It wasn't military. It looked handmade, something a child might make for a father, or the other way around. There was a burned-in initial, B. I didn't make the connection at the time. I just let the nurse in me keep going. But something in me hurt when I had to tear open his shirt. It felt like I wasn't ripping fabric, but a story. And that story recognized me. The scent of his skin brought back a flash from another time. A dark room, a baby's cry, and the sound of a wrought iron gate slamming shut as someone took away what was mine. No, I thought. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Time doesn't stitch these kinds of reunions. But wartime runs on rules that don't apply to the living. The head nurse told me to log his vitals and hurry on to the others. It was chaos that day. Dozens came in. But I couldn't walk away. I grabbed a pen and paper and, almost without realizing it, wrote down the name, Benjamin. A name I'd never said out loud. The name I gave to the baby I was forced to surrender. A memory from a time when I still wore flowered dresses and believed the world owed me something. I slipped that paper into my apron pocket without knowing why. I just knew that, in that moment, a piece of me was lying there on that stretcher. That night, I went to see him before my shift ended. He was breathing with difficulty. I tried speaking to him, but he only mumbled words I couldn't make out. One time it sounded like home. Another, Violet. My body went cold. Violet was the woman who took me in when I gave my baby away. She had promised he'd have everything I couldn't give. She promised he'd never know about me, and that it was for his own good. That name, whispered in the middle of the night by a boy on death's edge, made it feel like time had circled back to punish me. But I didn't cry. Not yet. Because nurses don't cry when others are bleeding more than they are. Nurses breathe deep, wash their hands, and carry on. But that night, when I went to clean my instruments, my hands started shaking. The tray crashed to the floor. The sound of metal rang out like a scream, and I knew, in that moment, that the war story I was living wasn't like the others. It was too emotional, too personal. It was mine. And it started with a sound I would never hear the same way again. There was a kind of look I was always taught to avoid. The look of men who came back from war, without ever truly coming back. Eyes fused with pain, fear, and some memory too big to fit inside their minds. It was like staring through a cracked mirror. You recognize something, but you could never tell if it was your reflection or what was left of the other person. And still, that morning, that exact look is what held me in front of bed 17. His eyes, that boy, that soldier whose name we still didn't know, whose file was incomplete, whose soul seemed to teeter so close to the edge of the world that he barely breathed. But there was something in his eyes that knew me, or worse, had been waiting for me. I spent most of the shift checking IVs, changing gauze, monitoring pulses. I could do it all with my eyes closed. But with him, every move felt deliberate, too precise. Like each fold in the sheet, each line in his vein, each sigh in the room exposed me to a question I'd avoided for over 20 years. Who are you, boy? Why does your presence make me remember arms that once cradled a tiny body wrapped in thin blankets, while a social worker explained that this was for everyone's good? I was tired. My back ached, and my head throbbed the way it always did when Saigon's humidity sank into smoke at dusk. But even with all the pain, there was something in me that kept pulling me back to his bedside. And it wasn't just because his condition was critical. It was because he was familiar. Not literally, but familiar like a tune you can hum even though you don't remember where you heard it. And then, during one of those quiet returns, he opened his eyes. Just for a few seconds. Maybe not even fully conscious. But those eyes, brown like the father he never knew, looked at me with a depth that broke me open. They cut right through me. And what I saw there wasn't fear or pain. It was recognition. Like time had done eternity a small favor. Those eyes didn't know my name, but they knew who I was. And I ran. Pretended I needed more saline, faked it, left the curtain half drawn and stepped out. Walked to the back of the triage tent and leaned against the sweat-drenched canvas. Took a deep breath. My fingers were shaking. My legs felt like soaked paper. Why did those eyes see me like that? Why did it hurt so much to see such a young face and feel like I owed him something? That's when I realized it wasn't just war that had broken him. It was time. It was the story etched into his body without him even knowing. And maybe, just maybe, that story was mine too. I went back, face composed, step steady, and the usual mask, the evacuation nurse who'd seen it all. But inside I was just a patched-up woman, trying not to fall apart. As I approached, I saw he was asleep again, breathing more heavily now, and the sound in his chest was like an old door groaning open. I adjusted the pillows, checked his bandages, and once again, his eyes fluttered open. It wasn't a hallucination. He saw me. Again. And in that look, there was no accusation. There was waiting. He tried to speak, bit his lower lip and mumbled a syllable I couldn't catch. I leaned in, ear close to his mouth. But all I heard was a dragged-out whisper, like someone fishing for words at the bottom of a dry well. But one word came out. Just one. Why? And my world stopped. Why? What? Why the pain? Why the war? Why the abandonment? Why does life keep stitching meetings that should have happened decades ago? I didn't answer. I just touched his forehead with the back of my hand and whispered, "Shh, you're safe." It was a lie. No one was safe there. Especially not him. I spent the rest of the day returning to his bed like someone visiting a grave. I was scared it would be his last day, and I'd never know the truth, or worse, that I'd know and be powerless to change it. I started noticing details, the shape of his nose, the curve of his jawline, his hands. Oh, his hands. They were my father's hands, strong, dense, but with long, delicate fingers. I remember holding a tiny hand like that when I had my baby. He'd grip my finger like he was trying to keep me from leaving. And now, decades later, those same hands lay resting on a military sheet, wrapped in wires, marked by battle and absence. A younger nurse asked if he was a relative. She'd noticed how careful I was being, said I seemed too involved. I laughed, a short, dry laugh, and told her no. I was just doing my job. She smiled back, but her eyes said she didn't believe me, and neither did I. Before ending my shift, I sat beside bed 17. Looked at his chart, now barely updated with triage info. Name, unknown. Estimated age, 22. Race, black. Possible Southern origin. Nothing that told me what I needed to know. Nothing that explained why my bones screamed every time he looked at me. Nothing that proved he was my son. But deep down, the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. And then, as if casually, I said, Benjamin. Just that. A test. A tiny offering to fate. And he, without opening his eyes, gently squeezed the hand I was holding. I don't know if he heard. I don't know if he understood. But I know that in that moment, my soul bowed. Because the eyes that looked at me without seeing knew too much. Sometimes I think war has its own twisted way of hiding what's precious. It buries memories in mud, tears open envelopes that should have never been touched by the wrong hands, and swaps names for numbers as easily as it rips lives from a mother's chest. During those days in Saigon, I developed a dangerous habit, checking the pockets of unconscious soldiers not to invade, but out of some human need, searching for anything that might tell me who they were before they were wounded. A photo, a medal, a folded-up prayer. And that day, as I changed that boy's blood-soaked uniform for a hospital gown, I found something that should never have been there. A letter, crumpled, soaked, hidden beneath the waistband, tucked between the stitching and a frayed lining. It was like he'd done everything to protect it, even unconscious, even nearly dead. My fingers touched the paper like they were holding a still-breathing secret. It was handwritten, the writing shaky, youthful, but clear. On the envelope, just one word, Violet. No last name, no address. Just that one name that, to the world, might have meant nothing, but to me was a blade. Violet. The woman who raised the child I couldn't. The name I had chosen through tears and broken promises, to be the guardian of everything I hadn't had the courage to be. Violet. The same Violet who held my baby to her chest, while I signed papers with trembling hands. The one who swore he'd have a decent life, free of stigma, free of shame, and far, far away from me. I slipped the letter into my apron pocket, unopened. My eyes couldn't take it. My soul, even less. I went back to work like someone trying to stop an invisible hemorrhage. The hospital was swarming with new wounded, muffled cries, and the constant hum of helicopters bringing more lives to the edge of surrender. But inside me, there was only silence. And that envelope, and that name, and the terrifying possibility that this boy was Benjamin. My Benjamin. The same baby born on a stifling night that smelled of cheap lotion and wet cotton. The same baby who had gripped my finger so tightly, I thought I'd never be able to let go. I didn't tell anyone, as if I could shield the world from what was falling apart inside me. But that night, with no critical patients left, with the ward lights dimmed to a soft flicker, I went back to bed 17. He was sleeping, or floating somewhere between this world and another where pain doesn't reach. His skin was pale, sweat beading down his temples, and his hands trembled slightly like they still wanted to write. I sat beside him and pulled the letter from my pocket. I smelled the paper aged by war, sweat, smoke, dried blood, and something else. Something not of this world. I traced the name with my fingers. Violet. And then, not brave enough for anything more, I pressed the envelope to his chest. and waited. Waited for sign. A sigh. A movement. A word. But all that came was a small shiver in his shoulders, like his body still recognized the writing, the name, the home he'd been ripped from. I didn't open it. I couldn't. That letter was his. For her. Maybe filled with truths I wasn't ready to hear. Maybe with confessions that were never mine to receive. But it existed. And the simple fact that it sat there, between us, made the ghosts around me take on flesh. I wondered what it said. If he called her mother. If he told her he was scared. If he asked for forgiveness. Or if, just maybe, he mentioned me, without knowing he did. Maybe it held words that didn't belong in trenches. Maybe he'd written about dreams, about coming home, about planting something when the war was over, about living. And maybe, just maybe, I was about to lose all of that for the second time. When I stood up, I left the letter tucked between the pillowcase and his pillow. I wanted it to stay with him, to not get lost between the paperwork, the bodies, the reports that would later end up in Washington. That letter, fragile as it was, held more war story than all the Army's archives combined. It didn't list dates or victories, but it smelled like everything that had been denied, and it carried the weight of what never reached its destination. The next day, the letter was still there, untouched. He hadn't woken up. His vitals were stable, but fragile, like a candle in the wind. And I started wishing he'd wake up, not just to confirm he was my son, but so he could read that letter, so he could speak his name out loud, so he could see me with those eyes that haunted me. But time is cruel to those who wait for the impossible, and that night, during patient baths, while we carefully cleaned his wounds, he opened his eyes for a few seconds and murmured, "Violet." I froze. The young nurse beside me thought he was delirious. But I knew. That word wasn't a hallucination. It was a compass. I couldn't sleep that night. I went back to the tent alone, feet soaked, heart clenched so tight I had to lie flat on the ground just to breathe. I replayed every single letter I'd never written. The ones stuck in my head, the ones lodged in my throat. I'd never told anyone about my son. Not once. The Army didn't allow that kind of vulnerability. Nurses were trained to serve, not to feel. But what if he really was Benjamin? What if, without even knowing, he'd tried to write to me and got the name wrong? Violet, Hattie. Two women divided by a signed paper and a system that decided what was right. A system that made me believe motherhood wasn't a right I deserved. That being black and alone meant I was less worthy of having a child. And now, in the middle of a war, there he was, asking the wrong woman to take him home. At the end of that day, when I returned to the ward to double-check medications, the letter was gone, no longer under the pillow, not in the uniform he wore. I asked around quietly. No one knew. Maybe a nurse picked it up by accident. Maybe it was tossed out. Or maybe it went with him, tucked to his chest, like a folded secret that was never meant for my eyes. And that's when I understood. Some letters don't need to be opened to be understood. Some emotional stories write themselves by simply existing. And that one was exactly like that. There's no siren more cruel than the one that starts from the inside. You think you're prepared, after weeks of seeing torn bodies, after hearing screams that don't come from pain, but from souls ripped open. But when night dresses in red, not just in the sky, everything that still stands inside you begins to collapse in silence. That was the worst night. Not because the gunfire was closer, not because the blood was heavier, but because that night the world caved in from the inside while I pretended it was just another shift in Saigon. The warning came over the radio. 2 helicopters hit. Casualties incoming, many, some critical. Code red, they said. When we heard that, we knew the sheets wouldn't be enough, that the bodies would arrive faster than the stretchers could carry, that we'd have to choose who to save first. And in that war, choosing was just a polite way of killing slowly. It was also a private torture for a nurse who, years earlier, had been forced to choose between love and shame, between a child and social survival. I still hear the muffled screams from that night, not just from the soldiers, but from the nurses themselves, from the chaplain, from the cook who dropped everything to help with towels and water. Even the silence screamed, because some nights, even God seems to hide behind the tents. And in the middle of all that chaos, he worsened. The boy in bed 17, my maybe son, my almost Benjamin, started bleeding again. The hemorrhage had returned, quiet, sneaky, like it waited for everyone to look away. I found him groaning, eyes sunken, sheets stained like flags caught in battle. A young doctor tried to locate the source of the bleeding, but his hands were trembling. He was new. He'd never seen a man die silently. I gently pushed him aside and took over, pressed on the abdomen, called for morphine, shouted for plasma. I yelled like someone begging for mercy, and the world kept falling apart around us. Men were carried in by arms, shouts of, "Doctor!" and "More gauze!" blended with the sound of helicopters flying too low. But all I saw was him, his eyes closing, that breath fading like wind dying out. And then he spoke. One word, just one. "Mom." It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was. His mouth shaped that word exactly. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't delirium. It wasn't the morphine. It was truth. A thread of consciousness. A goodbye. Or maybe a recognition. I'll never know. But in that instant, my knees gave out. The blood on my hands felt like it was mine. My head pounded like a funeral drum. The young nurse next to me didn't understand. Thought he was calling for the mother who raised him. And I kept pretending I was just a professional. But inside something had torn. Ripped open for good. A kind of pain no war, no ward, no military protocol could numb. He called me Mom. And even if he didn't know what he was saying, I knew. I knew like the earth itself whispered it to me. He was mine. I kept pressing the gauze, wiped his face, kissed his forehead, masking it as a comforting touch, and whispered, "Shh, I'm here." I was there. For the first time. For real. Not as a nurse, but as a woman who wouldn't run anymore. As a mother, even if just for one night. The other patients moaned. The chaplain shouted psalms no one heard. The tent walls shook with hot wind, heavy with dust and gunpowder. The ground vibrated with distant explosions. But me? I only heard his faint heartbeat. The monitor beeped slowly, and every beep was a countdown for everything I never got to say. As dawn neared, the hospital turned into a maze. Nameless men begging for help. Bodies piled on makeshift benches. And I, with blood-covered hands, walked in slow motion to the nurse station to report his deterioration. One nurse asked me, "Langston, are you okay?" I nodded, because speaking would have been confessing everything. I couldn't tell the sound of war from the sound of my own chest anymore. It was all mixed together, the same battlefield. When I returned to the tent, he was calm, breathing deeply but clear enough to squeeze my hand. I held his tight, looked him in the eye, and it was like staring into a rearview mirror. I saw my own face in his. I saw the years we never had, the birthdays that passed unnoticed, the cries of a baby I never rocked again. I saw everything and nothing, and I just said, "You're gonna be okay. Promise?" He smiled, a half smile, and that destroyed me. In that moment, it didn't matter if the letter had vanished, if anyone ever found out, if I could ever prove anything. My heart had already recognized his. And the war, in all its fury, paused for a second to give me one last shot at love. But even love in times of war has an expiration date. Some things seem to wait for the right moment to be found, as if they know truth has its own time to be born, and that before then, it would be just another burden. For days I carried the suspicion inside me like someone holding a cracked glass, carefully, fearfully, but without the courage to let it shatter. Until that afternoon when the head nurse asked me to sort through the personal belongings of a few soldiers being transferred or sent to the morgue. It was protocol, routine. But when she handed me a small, dark wooden box labeled Patient 17, my hands went cold. It was a simple box, the size of an old drawer. There was dust in the corners and a metal latch that looked like it had been forced open more than once. I took it to the little room behind the infirmary where we kept old files, expired meds, and other things nobody wanted. I closed the door gently, sat down, took a deep breath. That box carried more than papers. I could feel it. It had an emotional weight that couldn't be measured in grams. My hands hesitated. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. The latch creaked like a childhood door. And when I finally opened it, time stopped. Inside were 3 objects. The first was a folded envelope, edges torn like someone had opened it in a hurry. I recognized the handwriting before even reading it. The same shaky script from the letter addressed to Violet. But this envelope was different. It said, "If something happens to me, give this to my mother." My heart raced. The words blurred before my eyes. To my mother. And for a moment I wanted to believe it was meant for Violet, for any other woman, that it wasn't about me. But the twist in my gut, the sudden nausea, the shaking in my hands, everything inside me screamed otherwise. I opened the envelope slowly, and there it was. His full name, Benjamin Thomas Langston. Langston, my last name. The handwriting was his. The signature matched the one I'd seen in his medical records. And there, between parting words and notes of gratitude, was something that shattered the last intact piece of me. If my mother is still alive, I hope one day she forgives me. I never met her, but I think of her every time I hear the word home. It felt like being shot right through the soul. A wound that doesn't bleed on the outside, but tears everything up inside. I gripped the edge of the table. My legs gave out. I cried like I never had during that war, like I hadn't cried my entire adult life. I cried like the girl I was at 18, signing away motherhood and smiling at the adoption officer while saying it was fine. It was never fine. The second object in the box was a photograph, and not just any photo. It was a picture of me. Young, so young, wearing a floral dress and a headscarf. That photo had been taken by a friend before I left for nurse training. I had only given a copy to one person, Violet. I asked her to give it to the boy when he was old enough, but I never knew he'd keep it, that he'd bring it to war, that it would travel across oceans and trenches, only to return to my hands as living proof of a love that never died. My face stared at me from the past, and in my eyes was the same question haunting me now. Will he recognize me? The third object was a chain with a wooden pendant. I'd seen it before, around his neck in those first days. But now, as I touched it gently, I noticed something carved into the back. Not quite a word, but a set of initials. HML. My name. Hattie Mae Langston. He carved my initials. He knew. Somehow he knew. Maybe Violet told him. Maybe he found out from a document. Or maybe he just felt it, the same way I had. That there was a bond logic couldn't explain. I sat there, alone, in that stifling little room, my eyes burning, hands trembling, and the world crumbling around me. The war still roared outside, screams, explosions, commands. But inside that box was an entire universe, a sun, a war story no one else would tell, because it lived in the folds of time, between unthinkable choices and silences too heavy for any official report. I closed the box with reverence, like sealing a tomb too small for all the love it contained. I placed it back on the shelf with a new label, handwritten, "Keep separate." No one else would understand. But I did. That was the altar of my guilt, my regret, and my late redemption. That night I went back to the barracks and slowly took off my shoes, like shedding a lifetime of weight from my feet. I lay down on the thin canvas bed, hugged the pillow with a face still damp from crying, and whispered, "Forgive me, son." I didn't wait for an answer. I knew it wouldn't come. Or maybe it would. In the wind, in the rustling leaves at the edge of the tent, or in the whisper of a memory that refused to fade. There, in that moment, with my chest split open like a field wound, I understood what a truly emotional story is. It's not the one full of plot twists or battles. It's the one that unfolds in silence, in late recognition, in the moment you open a drawer expecting papers, and find yourself. Some silences stand like soldiers, firm, inflexible, trained to obey pain. But there are also the ones we choose, even knowing they'll hurt more than any spoken truth. After I found that box, after I read the words that confirmed what my body already knew, I sat at the edge of bed 17 and looked at him like it was the first time. As if that face I'd already loved in secret was now taking on a permanent shape. A name. Blood. Roots. Benjamin. My son. There he was, lying down, fragile, with tubes and wires running in and out of his body, as if fate itself were trying to keep him close just a little longer, just until I decided what to do with all of this. But the truth is, I didn't know what to do. There was no manual for this, no nursing handbook telling you what to do when the person on the stretcher is the same one you gave birth to and surrendered to the world, with promises of forgetting. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to hold him in my arms and say, "It's me. I'm your mother. I'm here." But at the same time, part of me knew it might be too late, and that saying it now wouldn't heal anything. It would only tear open one more wound on a body already too torn to be stitched again. That night I stayed with him until the end of my shift. I changed the sheets, cleaned the IV sites, and gently folded the spare sheet lying at the foot of the bed. In that fold, between cotton and silence, I hid the letter he'd written to his mother. To me. I folded it gently, like folding a secret, and I tucked it there, between fabric and absence, because I knew that as long as it stayed there, he still had hope, still had a voice, still had one last chance to exist with dignity, even if the world never learned his full name. Choosing not to tell him might have been the cruelest thing I ever did to myself, but it was also an act of love, the kind of love that protects through silence, because I was afraid of what that truth might do to him, and to me. What would the army say? What right did I have after 22 years of absence? And what if he woke up and didn't want to know? What if he hated me, or worse, didn't believe me? It felt easier to let him rest in peace, to let him sleep knowing someone was there for him. No names, no labels, just presence. And that I could give. The days that followed, I walked between the tents like I was walking on glass. Every time I heard his name, my heart raced. And still, I stuck to protocol. I signed paperwork as Hattie Langston, not as a mother. I cared for the other soldiers with the same dedication, but I returned to bed 17 like someone returning home. I touched his face, hummed songs I remembered from childhood, placed warm compresses on his hands even when no one asked me to. All in silence. All hidden between a fold in the sheets. One afternoon, while adjusting his medication, the young nurse Rachel looked at me with eyes that knew too much. She didn't ask directly. She just said, "You have a different way with him." I smiled without answering, because answering would have meant confessing. And confession, in war, is a luxury reserved for those who can afford to break. I couldn't. Not there. Not with so many counting on me for strength, for control, for steadiness. I was a nurse, the one who kept everyone standing. But inside I was unraveling in slow motion. Then one night, when everything was too quiet for what we were used to, I decided to sit beside him a little longer. I took the letter from the sheet's fold, smoothed the paper with my fingers, and began to read it out loud in a low voice. He didn't wake up, but his breathing changed. It deepened, as if, even unconscious, he could hear. The letter was short. He said he missed a place he'd never known. That he sometimes dreamed of a woman with a colorful scarf in her hair. That he wished he'd had the courage to ask more about his birth. That he forgave, even without knowing what had happened. When I finished reading, I cried in silence. And for the first time I let a tear fall onto his chest. Just one. But in it, there were 22 years of waiting, of pain, of silence between letters never sent, between words that piled up like dust on an abandoned altar. The next morning the letter was gone. Did someone pick it up without noticing? Did a nurse clear the sheets and toss it away? Or was it him, who finally woke up and kept it for himself? I'll never know. But in that moment, I felt like the message had reached him. That somehow, even without saying it, I'd made myself known. And he, even without hearing me say, "I'm your mother," maybe felt that there, between medicine and pain, someone loved him in a way no one else ever could. In war, I learned that some truths don't save. They only wound, and that there are secrets best left unspoken, tucked instead between folds of sheets, folded gently, like promises stitched by hand. Promises that, even at the end, even in silence, love found a way to stay. Some people walk among the living as if they're only passing through, like they know too much to get involved, yet see everything with the eyes of someone who's felt every pain, every loss, up close. Chaplain Robert D. Mather was like that. A thin man in a worn suit, hollow eyes, and a voice shaped by years of funerals and whispered confessions under the thunder of bombs. He didn't pray loud, didn't wear big crosses, and almost never imposed faith where it wasn't asked for. But he was always there, standing in the shadows of the infirmary, listening more than speaking. And when he did speak, every word landed like a church bell echoing through a ghost town. He came to find me on the second day after the collapse. I was gathering empty vials in the side storage room, hands still stained with gauze and iodine, when I felt a silent presence behind me. I turned and saw him, hat in hand, shoulders bent, and that look that needed no introduction. He knew. I knew he knew, even before he spoke. The way you know a storm's coming even when the sky is clear. Your heart tightens before the first thunder. He stepped closer slowly, like he was stepping into someone else's grief, and said only, "Langston, may I tell you something I've held in too long?" I nodded, scared, ashamed, relieved in a way that almost hurt. He told me he'd recognized Benjamin as soon as the papers reached the chaplain's office, as they always did when there wasn't a clear ID from the field. He said he saw the full name, the initials on the necklace, and he saw the photograph. "The same one you've kept in your locker pocket since 1953, he added. I didn't know what to say. I didn't ask how he knew, because in that moment it was like God had borrowed someone else's voice to give me mine back. The chaplain knew. He knew everything, and he hadn't told anyone. He explained gently that he chose to keep it quiet because he felt that this wasn't a story that belonged to the world. It belonged to me, and to Benjamin, and maybe even Benjamin himself wasn't ready to hear it. Sometimes the purest kind of love is the one that stays silent, he said. And for a second I wanted to hate him for that, wanted to scream. You should have told me. You should have given me the chance to be his mother, even for 1 minute. But I didn't, because I understood. Deep down, he'd done what I had done. He chose silence, chose protection over exposure. And that broke me, because I realized my secret was no longer mine alone. He asked about you, the chaplain said. In one of our talks, he asked if I believed mothers could still love from far away, even without a name or a face or presence. And after a long pause, he added, I told him yes, that sometimes those are the mothers who love the most. My legs gave way. I leaned against a shelf lined with rusted cans and felt my chest lock like a door barred from the inside. He asked about me, even without knowing it was me, even without knowing I was there. Just inches, seconds, breaths away. That crushed me, because I'd never been so close to something so precious and yet so powerless to do anything about it. Then the chaplain handed me a note, a small piece of paper folded 4 times, written in Benjamin's hand. He'd written it on a clear sky morning when he thought he was getting better. Just 1 line. If someday my mother comes through here, tell her there's still time. The handwriting was shaky, but strong, like someone writing not to be read, but to leave a mark. I held that paper like it was glass, and I read it over 20 times that same day. That 1 line became my private gospel, my forbidden psalm. There's still time. But time for what? The chaplain didn't stay much longer after that. He squeezed my hand, looked me in the eyes like someone who understood, and left. He didn't tell me to pray, or to confess. He just honored my silence. Because there are some pains even God doesn't touch. Some secrets even faith chooses not to name. That night I returned to the infirmary, but something in me had changed. I was no longer the woman who was hiding. I was the woman who had been seen. And that terrified me, but it also gave me courage. I sat beside bed 17, where he still slept under sedation, and held his hand. I stayed like that for hours. No talking, no tears, just breathing with him. Around us, the world faded into background noise. The sound of syringes being sorted, beds creaking, IV bags dripping. Everything blurred into the moment where love said nothing, but stayed anyway. And for the first time, I thought about telling him, about saying it, about introducing myself. But fear still weighed more. The fear that it was too late, that he wouldn't want to know, or that he wouldn't believe me. The fear of losing again, so I did what I've always known how to do. I wrote a letter, a short one, a simple one. No name, no signature. Just words that came out like breath. I saw you born. I saw you sleep in silence, and now I see you fighting to stay. And I am here. Not as a shadow, not as a memory, but as flesh, as blood, as care. Even if you never know, it's me. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and hid it. I couldn't bring myself to leave it on his bed, not yet. But that night was different, because now I knew someone else knew, and somehow that made the weight of silence a little easier to carry. I always believed war could steal everything, except the rituals. Even when there were no flowers, no funerals, no marked graves, there was still the gesture, The way we folded a dead man's hands over his chest. The way nurses closed soldiers' eyes with the tips of their index fingers. The quiet pause before pulling up the sheet. In those details, we still tried to be human. And that was all I had left that sunless morning. The gesture. The only thing I could give Benjamin, now that time had decided his moment had come. The dawn was eerily silent. No helicopters. No gunfire. A thick stillness spread across the tent, like the air had turned heavy. The soldiers slept or slipped into delirium, and the infirmary felt like a temple where only ghosts moved. I passed by him just after 4. There was a slight change in his skin. The tone was off. His breathing had shifted, shallower, quicker, like he was already saying goodbye, without a word. I approached slowly, clutching the clipboard to my chest, trying to convince myself there was still time. But there was a scent only those who've been too long surrounded by death can recognize. It wasn't blood, not medicine. It was the smell of absence settling in, a damp kind of emptiness that fills the room seconds before a soul departs. I took his hand, cold, but still warm enough to make me hesitate. I touched his face with my fingertips, followed the tube running from his arm, the curve of his shoulder now sunken into the mattress, and finally, his eyes, half open, the same eyes that once looked at me without knowing. Or maybe knowing too much. They no longer moved, fixed on some distant point. Or maybe on an old time, when I cradled him for a few minutes before giving him away. I called for the head nurse without a word. Just a look. She came, checked the vitals, gave a small, respectful nod. Benjamin was gone, quietly, without goodbye, like a son walking out the front door, never to return. They told me to step aside, that they would handle the removal. But I couldn't. I asked to do it myself. It wasn't protocol. But that was my only chance to care for him as a mother, even if the world never knew. I went to my metal locker, took out a small scarf I'd kept for decades. It no longer smelled like it used to. The colors had faded. It was a washed-out blue, hand-stitched around the edges. I wore it tied in my hair when I was pregnant. It was my talisman, my symbolic hiding place. And now, it would be the last thing to touch my son's skin. I returned to bed 17. Nurse Rachel had already covered him up to his chest. She looked at me gently and left without a word. Left me alone with him. I knelt down, looked into his eyes one last time. And then, with the tip of my fingers, placed the scarf over his eyes, slowly, as if I were telling him a story through that gesture. A war story, yes, but also a story of reunion, even if the reunion was only mine. I whispered, "You won't see the war anymore, my son. Only peace." My fingers lingered on his forehead for a few seconds, and in that space, time froze. There was no uniform, no protocols, no nurse station, just me and him, and the silence between us. An old silence, inherited, chewed up by life, but now whole. The scarf covered his eyes but didn't hide him from me. On the contrary, in that moment I saw him more completely than ever. I saw the baby I once rocked, the boy I imagined running through someone else's backyard, the teenager who might have searched for me in strangers' faces his whole life, the man who, even wounded, still tried to love with whatever the war hadn't taken. When they finished the formal procedures, I asked to walk with his body to the transport shelter. Another nurse said it wasn't necessary, but the head nurse allowed it. "Langston knows what she's doing," she said. They didn't know. No one knew. But they let me. I walked beside the stretcher covered in white linen, the blue scarf tucked beneath the sheet's fold. A single drop of dew slid down one corner of the tent's canvas. And I thought how unfair war was, even with the rain. How it always fell at the wrong time. But that day, The rain came softly, like someone crying out of respect, like it understood that some departures don't need storms, only silence. And when the makeshift coffin was sealed, I took my pen and wrote a name no one else saw, in the corner of the raw wood, tiny, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Benjamin T. Langston. Because he deserved to be called by his full name, because he was mine. And even if the world never knew, that would know, and that was enough. I returned to the empty tent, sat down, breathed, closed my eyes, and repeated just to myself. I was with him till the end. Not as a nurse, not as a witness, but as a mother who covered her son's eyes with an old scarf, as if to say, "You can go now. You are loved." Of all the ways war chooses to haunt a woman, maybe none is as cruel as an official envelope arriving by mail. It has no scent, no voice, just silence, sealed with a military stamp. When I received that envelope, it had already been 3 weeks since I left Saigon. My knees still ached from the hospital floor, and the sound of helicopters still visited my ears whenever the wind rattled the windows. I was back in Texas, staying at my younger sister's house, waiting for a spot to open at the civilian infirmary. I hadn't told anyone about Benjamin, not about the scarf, not about the name I had written in the corner of the coffin, but that envelope couldn't be ignored. It was morning. The sun was beating down on the porch. The mailbox was hot like a pan left too long on the stove. I opened it slowly. A brown packet. No handwritten sender, just the cold, raw words. Department of the Army. And inside, a photograph. Black and white, worn edges, thick, almost waxy paper. The image of a young man in military gear, shoulders squared. A look caught between smiling and guarding. It was him, Benjamin, there, frozen in a moment that time had chosen to preserve, as if giving me what life never had the courage to offer, the right to look into my son's face. I sat slowly in the high-backed chair in the living room. My legs were weak, breath shallow, eyes brimming. I held the photo in both hands, the way you hold a baby, and for a second I forgot the war, forgot the tubes, the gauze, the sheet, because in front of me was a boy, a man, a son, mine. I studied every detail, the way he held his helmet under his arm, the crease of his collar, his big hands. But what struck me most were his eyes, those same eyes I had watched silently so many times, between nursing shifts and soul repair. Now they were here, looking back at me. And in that frozen image there was a piece I had never seen in him while he breathed. As if the paper understood more than flesh ever could. As if in that single click he had allowed himself to fully exist. I cried. But not loudly. I cried the way you cry when you've learned to keep your grief behind closed doors. Muffled sounds, controlled sobs, a wet face no one would see. Because that was my war now. Learning to live with a photograph instead of a hug, with a piece of paper instead of a presence, with a name typed on the back in government script instead of the whispered word, Mom. I spent days with that photo in my hands, slept with it beneath my pillow, woke up and placed it on the dresser. No one in the house knew who he was. My sister assumed he was just some soldier I'd grown fond of. "Those things happen during war, don't they?" she said with no malice. And I just smiled, because explaining would mean offering up a part of my pain that was still too raw to show. But there was a time of day, always in the afternoon, when the sun lit the hallway wall, when I'd take the photograph, sit on the floor, lean my back against the wall, knees pulled up, and in silence, I would speak to him. Not aloud, but inwardly. I'd say the things I never said while he was alive. I'd apologize. I'd tell him about the mornings I felt him move inside me, about the scent of the powder I used the last time I rocked him, about the floral dress I wore the day I let him go. And he, from the photograph, would listen with eyes that understood, eyes that forgave. One afternoon, my granddaughter, still little, braided hair and curious eyes, walked into the room and saw the photo on my lap. "Who's that, Grandma?" she asked. I froze, but without thinking I answered, "A very brave young man." She smiled and said, "He looks like you," and ran off chasing a doll. I sat there, stunned by that sentence. "He looks like you," because he did. In the eyes, the shape of the jaw. And for the first time, I accepted that as full truth. Yes, he was mine, with or without paperwork, with or without a grave marked beside mine. He was mine. I placed the photograph in a dark wooden frame, set it on the mantel, next to the folded American flag the Army had sent with the condolence letter. No one asked again who he was, and I never told. But everyone who walked past it knew that photo held more than a face. It held a secret, an absence, a piece of my heart. Sometimes I take the photo and press it to my chest, close my eyes and imagine what it would have been like to watch him grow up. Would he have loved music? Would he have married? Would he have called me Mom one day? With a clear voice, with a smile, without delirium? But those thoughts never last long, because war doesn't leave room for imagined futures. It trains us to hold on to memories the way we hold on to wounds, closed, but never healed. So I put the photo back in its place, straighten the frame, and walk away slowly, like someone leaving a sanctuary, because inside that rectangle of paper lives everything that's left, and that, just that, is more than many mothers ever had. My house is small, but everything that truly matters fits inside a yellowed cardboard box tucked away in the back of a closet that used to be the guest room and is now my refuge. It has no lock, no decoration. Just a piece of faded tape holding the lid down, like someone trying to keep the past sealed with their fingertips. No one ever asked about it. Not my sister, not my granddaughter, not the rare visitors who, when they do come, care more about the smell of coffee than the secrets tucked between old walls. And maybe that's for the best, because inside that box lives what no one sees: a scarf, a folded letter, a black and white photo, and a name nearly forgotten by the world. The first time I opened that box after the war was on a night so quiet I could hear my bones crack when I stood up from the armchair. I pulled the box from the back of the closet, brushed the dust off with wrinkled hands, and sat on the floor, like someone about to summon something sacred. I didn't cry right away, because sometimes memory comes dry, without tears. But when I opened the lid and saw that blue scarf, folded like a crooked origami, a weight climbed up my throat. That same scarf that covered Benjamin's eyes, the one I wore in my hair at 18, pregnant and scared of the world, the one I took with me to Saigon without knowing it would become the funeral veil of an interrupted love. Beneath the scarf, the photograph, the one I received by mail, a portrait of a man in uniform, eyes that seemed to pierce through the frame. Sometimes I think that photo is the only thing keeping me from forgetting what his face looked like. And that scares me, because no mother should need paper to remember her child. But time is cruel to memory. It strokes what hurts and erases what was precious. So I keep that photo the way someone keeps oxygen, and return to it whenever the world feels too small to hold the longing. And then there's the letter. The original, the one he wrote to the mother he never met. I don't know how it found its way back to me. Maybe a nurse recovered it. Maybe it was the chaplain. I never found out. All I know is that it appeared inside my duffel bag, carefully folded between service forms like someone, or something greater than all of us, wanted to make sure it returned to where it belonged. I placed it in the box, along with everything I never dared say aloud. Sometimes I read it in a whisper. Sometimes I just rest my forehead against the paper and stay there, quiet, like listening to a forgotten prayer. There's also something no one knows about. A hospital ID tag labeled Patient 17. Just a piece of plastic, worn, numbers nearly erased. But for me, it's the altar of my memory, the last name he had before I called him by his full one. Sometimes I think about throwing it away, about forgetting everything, pretending none of it ever happened. But then I hear that whisper in the middle of the night, Mom, and I put everything back in its place. The box takes up no space, but it weighs like it carries a whole grave. And in a way it does, because every time I open it, I bury a little more of the woman I used to be. The one who waited for letters that never came. The one who stitched silence where guilt lived. The one who learned to love without rights, without voice, without her name on a birth certificate, and who still loved to the very end. One day my granddaughter walked in while I had the box open. I closed it slowly, without alarm. She asked what it was. I told her. Old war things from Grandma. And she believed me, because children believe in silences in a way grown-ups forget. She smiled, hugged me, and ran off. And I stayed there, hugging that box like holding my own heart outside my body. Sometimes I think about writing it all down, leaving a note with the box, so that when I'm gone, someone will know. But I always change my mind, because some things don't need to be told, just felt. And because, deep down, this war story doesn't belong to anyone but me and him, and maybe God. So the box stays there, untouched, expecting nothing, holding everything. A tiny capsule of the impossible, the love that survived absence, the forgiveness that was never spoken aloud, and the certainty that even without paperwork, even without shared holidays, even without a Mom said over breakfast, we were mother and son, in silence, in gestures, in the final fold of a hospital sheet, and now, in this box. And if one day someone finds it and asks what's inside, just say, what remains when the world insists on forgetting? What's left is this emotional story, this war story no one knows, this love story no one saw being born, but that never ever died. Some women leave inheritances, others family recipes. Some leave jewelry, portraits on the wall, neatly signed documents. I leave none of that. Just a hidden box, a folded scarf, a letter I didn't write, and a name I carry in my chest like someone hiding an altar inside their body. The name of a son who never called me mother, but who recognized me with his eyes, even at the edge of death. You know, my dear, time taught me many things. That wars don't end when the shooting stops. That grief doesn't begin with a burial, but with the first unspoken what if. That there are war stories that will never make it into books, because they have no dates, no maps, no generals. They are too emotional to fit into reports. They live inside forgotten cardboard boxes, inside sheets folded with more care than life ever gave us. I've lived 60 years with this secret, and if I chose to tell you now, it's because maybe you have a box like this too. Maybe you carry a name you've never said out loud, a memory you hold like a candle in the dark, an absence no one else sees, but that follows you, even as you fall asleep. And I want to tell you from the bottom of my wrinkled heart that this is love too. Even without recognition, even without forgiveness, even without a family photo. Because being a mother isn't just about giving birth or raising. Sometimes it's remembering. Sometimes it's knowing. Sometimes it's holding someone's hand and choosing to stay, even if they never call you by the right name. If this story spoke to you, stay with me. Don't leave without leaving a sign. Write in the comments the name you carry in your heart, or the silence you haven't been able to name. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to love in the dark. Like, subscribe, and come back often. Here in this little corner of the screen, there's a place for those who've never been heard, but have always been felt. And remember, my dear, even silence has memory. And sometimes, that's where the truest loves live.